What if people could edit their memories? It begins with something so small you almost ignore it. A moment you wish you could forget. Nothing dramatic, nothing life-changing, just something uncomfortable. A conversation that went wrong, a mistake you keep replaying, a memory that returns at the worst possible time, pulling you out of the present and back into something you would rather leave behind. You close your eyes, and for a second, you think about removing it, not suppressing it, not ignoring it, actually removing it. And then something happens. The memory shifts, not fades, not weakens, it changes. The details blur for a fraction of a second, like a video skipping a frame, and then it is gone. Completely. You open your eyes. You try to recall it. You know something was there. You know you wanted to forget something, but the content is missing. There is no image, no sound, no feeling, just an empty space where something used to exist. First, you are confused, then curious, then something else. Relieved, because the weight is gone, the discomfort is gone, and in its place, nothing. Across the world, the same moment unfolds. People begin to notice small gaps in their memory. At first, they assume it is normal, just a moment of forgetfulness, something that happens every day. But then they realize something important. They did not forget. They chose to remove. And once that realization spreads, everything changes. People begin to test it carefully. They think about a minor embarrassment, a small regret, something safe, and they try again. The memory flickers, distorts, and disappears instantly.
No delay,
No effort,
no consequences.
at least not immediately. Within hours, the world begins to understand what has happened. Memory is no longer fixed. It is editable. At the same time, something deeper begins to shift. People begin to experiment, not just removing memories, but changing them. You recall a moment, you adjust a detail, you imagine it differently, and when you open your eyes, that version replaces the original. Completely. You remember what you created, not what actually happened, and that creates something powerful. Control. Because memory is not just storage. It is identity. It defines who you are, how you think, how you feel, and now can be rewritten. At first, people use it carefully. They remove pain, loss, fear. They soften difficult experiences, reshape them into something easier to carry. A bad conversation becomes neutral. A failure becomes less significant. A painful moment becomes distant. And in that change, something happens. Life feels lighter, easier, more stable, but only at the surface. At the same time, something deeper begins to emerge. Consistency breaks, because memory is what connects moments together, creates continuity, cause and effect. Without it, that connection begins to weaken. You forget why you feel a certain way. You forget why you made a decision. You forget what led you to where you are. And that creates confusion, not immediate, but gradual. At the same time, something else begins to happen. People begin to compare, not openly, but internally. Some choose to keep their memories. Others remove them. Some reshape their past into something perfect. Others leave it untouched. And that creates a difference, not in what happened, but in what is remembered. Because now, reality is not shared equally. It is filtered, individually. At the same time, something deeper begins to affect relationships. A person says, "I remember that." Another says, "That never happened." And both are telling the truth from their perspective, because memory is no longer reliable. Not because it is weak, but because it is changeable. And that creates tension, because shared history is no longer shared. At the same time, something unexpected begins to happen. Regret disappears, not completely, but significantly, because regret depends on memory. And if you remove the memory, you remove the regret. first, this feels like freedom, because people are no longer trapped by their past. They can move forward without weight, without guilt, without pain. But over time, something else disappears. Learning. Because learning depends on remembering mistakes, understanding consequences, seeing patterns. Without that, behavior begins to repeat, not intentionally, but naturally, because the past is no longer guiding the present. At the same time, something deeper begins to affect identity. You begin to change who you are, not through experience, but through editing. You remove parts of yourself, add others, reshape your story, until the person you remember being is no longer the person who actually lived those moments. And that creates a gap between reality and identity. As the first day comes to an end, as people begin to understand what they can do, one realization becomes impossible to ignore. This is not just about forgetting. It is about control, the ability to choose your past, to decide what stays and what disappears. But the more you change it, the less you know what is real, because memory is not just a record. It is a foundation, and if you keep rewriting the foundation, you may not recognize what you have built on top of it. Because in the end, if you can edit everything you remember, you may eventually forget who you really were. It does not stay controlled. That is the first thing people begin to realize after the initial excitement fades. At first, editing memories feels like freedom. You remove what hurts, adjust what bothers you, reshape moments until they fit the version of yourself you want to carry forward. It feels clean, efficient, almost perfect. But control over memory does not mean control over consequence. Because memory is not just something you hold. It is something that holds you. As days pass, small inconsistencies begin to appear. You walk into a place that feels familiar, but you cannot explain why. You meet someone who reacts to you with warmth, with history, with meaning, and you do not remember them. Not because you forgot, but because you chose not to remember. At the time, it felt like a good decision. Now, it feels like something is missing. At the same time, something deeper begins to happen. Your decisions start to lose context. You make choices, but you are no longer sure what shaped them. You feel certain about something, but you cannot trace the reason back to a specific experience. The cause has been removed, but the effect remains. And that creates instability, not in action, but in understanding, because you are acting without knowing why. At the same time, something else begins to emerge. People begin to notice patterns in others, not in what they say, but in what they do not remember. A conversation happens. Later, one person recalls it clearly. The other denies it completely, not out of deception, but because it no longer exists for them. And that creates a new kind of conflict, not based on disagreement, but on different realities. Because memory is no longer shared. It is edited, individually. At the same time, relationships begin to fracture in subtle ways. Trust weakens, not because people lie, but because they can remove the truth. Promise made, then erased. A mistake acknowledged, then forgotten. A moment shared, then rewritten. And over time, the connection between people becomes unstable. Because connection depends on continuity, on shared memory, on knowing that what happened still exists for both of you. Without that, relationships become temporary, fragile, uncertain. At the same time, something deeper begins to affect identity. People begin to optimize themselves, not gradually, but intentionally. They remove failures, they adjust weaknesses, they reshape experiences until their past reflects the version of themselves they want to believe in. And at first, it works. Confidence increases, doubt disappears, fear fades, because all of those things were tied to memory, and memory has been changed. But something else disappears with them, depth, because struggle creates understanding. Mistakes create perspective. Pain creates awareness. And without those things, identity becomes shallow, stable on the surface, but lacking foundation. At the same time, something unexpected begins to happen. People begin to feel disconnected from themselves, not because they changed, but because they changed too much. They look at their own lives and feel a gap between what they remember and what they feel. Emotions appear without clear origin. Reactions happen without clear cause, and that creates a strange sensation, as if you are living a story that someone else edited. At the same time, something else begins to emerge: dependence. People start relying on memory editing not just for major events, but for everything. Small discomforts, minor frustrations, moments of doubt, all become candidates for removal or adjustment. And over time, this creates a pattern: avoidance, not of reality, but of experience. Because instead of processing something, you erase it, and that changes how you grow. At the same time, something deeper begins to affect society. Records become unreliable, not because they are false, but because people are. Testimony loses meaning. History becomes unstable, because even if something happened, it can be removed from the people who experienced it. And without memory, experience disappears. At the same time, something unexpected begins to be valued. Unedited minds. People who choose not to change their memories become different. Not better, but more consistent. They carry their past fully, with all its flaws, all its weight, all its truth. And in that consistency, something returns: trust, because what they remember does not change, and that becomes rare. At the same time, something deeper begins to settle. People begin to realize that memory is not just about comfort. It is about continuity, connects who you were to who you are. And if you break that connection too often, you begin to lose something essential, not your past, but your understanding of it. And without that understanding, identity becomes unstable. As months pass, the world adjusts again, not by removing the ability, but by redefining how it is used. Some limit it, some stop using it entirely. Others continue, shaping their lives into something smoother, easier, more controlled. But no matter what they choose, the consequence remains, because memory is not just a record, it is a structure. And every time you change it, you change yourself, sometimes in ways you understand, sometimes in ways you do not. And in that realization, a final truth begins to settle. The past was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be real, because its imperfections are what made you who you are. And if you remove them, you may create a better story, but you may also lose the person who lived it.